Thank you very much for that introduction. That saved me some time, as I was going to say exactly that, who my collaborators are in this research. I'll just jump directly then to the research question, which is how can we find the descriptors to capture subtle differences in timbre for drum sounds? And this may not be something as relevant to everyone, you might think, but at least for drummers, this is actually something that we use, for instance, when tuning the drum or monitoring the playing activities so that we play evenly and don't stick out too much. But there are many parameters that influence that sound from a drum, and it depends on many things, like for instance, depending on where you hit the drum, you excite different drum modes. You also have different force pulses that depend on the effective mass and the angle and things of the drumstick hitting the drum head. And of course, there's the drum itself, which has a lot of different resonances, so which we try to avoid in this work. So this work took its beginning more than 10 years ago when I was in Hanover, and we had a project trying to connect the link between the movement and the sound control for drummers. We had a fairly complex setup measuring audio, motion capture, and muscle activity, contact force and duration, and I won't go into that, but the idea was essentially to try to manipulate the instructions so that we could also manipulate the grip and the movement. And we did this with an instruction that instructed people to manipulate the end position of the drumstick after hitting. And we can see here how that works. Essentially, we had one player here playing 2 mezzoforte stroke, and one stroke, the drumstick is bouncing up to normal height, and in the other one, the drummer is trying to control the height of the drumstick after the strokes, and they're both aligned at this. And let's see if I can play this once also. So I can hear a difference, and we would like to know that others could do that as well. And that was another bounce. And now let's see if I can change. Yes, so we had 8 participants listening to these sounds and sorting them and rating them according to timbre and attack. And the first observation is that, yes, there seemed to be a difference, but that these descriptors seem to be very highly correlated. And we would like to do this in a different way, but what descriptors should we use to then distinguish and select the strokes from? And the fact is that the attack part of these strokes are very short. The contact time is very short. And if you measure the actual attack part in the waveform, it's between 2.5 milliseconds to at most 10 milliseconds. So these descriptors that we have to choose from, are they actually useful for this? And that's sort of where things halted for about 10 years or so, until I got the courage to take it up again. And in the meantime, there was some other research being published. Most predominantly here, I'll talk about that work from the group in Oslo with Danielson et al. They reported the effect of timing instructions on drum sound parameters for drummers playing on a drum kit with a normal backbeat pattern, which they were asked to place the snare stroke on the beat, a little bit laid back or a little bit pushed. And they could report effects on sound pressure level, tempered centroid, and spectral centroid. And this was later replicated in drums again, and guitar and bass that has been now published. And if you're more interested in this, then please go and check out the TIME project on Ritmo at the University of Oslo. We can also see that there's been reports about participants being able to identify an instrumental sound form, also very short time snippets, from 6 to 63 milliseconds. If we combine the research by Sud et al. And Francesco and my report a few years ago. So there seems to be possible to do this, but the question is again, like what type of parameters and descriptors can we use for these very short strokes that are for drums? And we might need to differentiate and divide the the drum stroke and the signal into some portions. And we can do this in different ways. So there's been, for instance, the approach of Siedenberg and Doklo that separated translator from the stationary part of a signal using shrinkage and the short-term Fourier transform. And this is very interesting, but perhaps not as useful for us in this case, because we're interested in the times rather, or the windows. So we went more with the approach that Danielson and et al. Used in 2015. They took the temporal centroid, the energy weighted mean of the signal, and averaged that across many strokes and took the grand mean, and around that symmetrically, they calculated the descriptions based on a 125 millisecond window symmetrically around that. Let's see if I can change the slide again. So our data, again, that was collected in Hanover was 1,102 drum strokes played on a 14-inch rototome. And if you don't know what a rototome is, I have a picture right here. So the good thing about this one is that you can tune it by rotating the rim. And the other thing more useful for us is that it doesn't actually have a shell. So it's more like a membrane without a drum. We had 8 professional players in this data collection. 4 of them were patients coming to the institute, either because of pain or focal dystonia, and predominantly in the non-dominant arm. They had the same instruction, and I should say that this was affecting them mostly at other types of playing, so fast and loud, for instance. They had the same instructions to play mezzoforte stroke. That was up to them to decide what mezzoforte was, and letting each stroke ring out. So for normal strokes, they let the stick bounce as normal, and for the controlled strokes, they were asked to stop the stick as close as possible to the drum head immediately after the stroke. We separated the files into single strokes and divided them into different phases according to the attack. The early decay phase, which we defined as the maximum P to the temporal centroid, and the later decay, which we took as from the temporal centroid to the offset of the stroke. And we used MR toolbox algorithms, and specifically we used an updated version of the near onset to find this attack and decay point. And I'll show that on the next slide here. So for the attack, we have here the rectified waveform in blue, and we found the attack here as a threshold of 3% up to the maximum peak. Then we find the max part here on the from the envelope to avoid influence necessarily of spurious peaks. And then we have the temporal centroid between this max peak and the offset, which was 3% again. And here we have the late decay phase. Here we have the early decay phase. Here is this little short attack phase. And then we have the total duration between these two. And based on these different phases, 4 in all, we calculated the duration, the log attack time, sound pressure level, spectral centroid, the temporal centroid. We took the spectral flatness, and then we took the temporal flatness, essentially the same thing, but on the waveform to find the peaks. And then we also used the Crest factor. And again, we used the MRI toolbox for these. So as you would expect, there are different correlations here that we can see here in the covariance matrix. There are some correlations that are expected. For instance, the late decay and the total part of the waveform, they overlap a lot in time, so those effects are fairly correlated. We also have some attack descriptors that correlate a lot. For instance, the attack Crest and the spectral centroid. And overall, from our inspection, both the visual inspection of the waveform and listening on this, we decided that we were more interested in this early decay part. So after the immediate attack, but before the temporal centroid. And you can see here 2 of these descriptors, and there is some correlation between them. The spectral centroid and the Crest factor and the temporal flatness. These are the ones that we decided to focus on for a model. Before I go to that, I would like to also show that there are indeed very individual differences between the players. So not only do we have two groups of players, here on top we have the patients, and on the bottom we have the 4 healthy players. And you see the yellow being the normal strokes and the black one being the controlled strokes. And these are estimates of distributions for the early decay spectral centroid. And as you can see, it's very differing how much they actually differed between the different strokes. So some are very concentrated, like for the first patient and here. Some have more of a spread, but overlapping between the 2 types of strokes. And actually there's only 2 players, this patient and this healthy player, that really consistently make a difference between the 2 types of strokes. And in some cases, you might expect that they didn't actually stop the stick as well, but there's more to that than that, because we don't know exactly how they held during the time. So for this, we did an approach with a multi-level Bayesian general linear models with a skewed normal link function and informative priors. We had increasingly complex models, starting from the most simple one, with essentially just the grouping structure. And then we built up to the full model. And testing between this, we ended up with the full model. And I will quickly go through these models now. There's a lot of information now, but I will concentrate on the main part. So the best univariate model for the early decay phase and the spectral centroid, including both the group that is it a healthy player, as you see here in 0, or a patient in 1 here, arm being the dominant or the non-dominant arm, and the condition being, again, in yellow, the normal strokes, or in black, the controlled strokes. And the estimate here is what we're most concerned with, because that tells us something of whether this could actually be useful for a later listening test. So mu for spectral centroid in the early decay phase was generally higher for healthy subjects and the controlled strokes. And in terms of variation, we had higher variation for the controlled strokes. So this could indicate that this was a little bit more of an unfamiliar task for the players, regardless of being healthy or affected. For the temporal flatness in the early decay phase, we had a mu estimate being slightly higher for patients overall, whereas variability was had one extreme case for healthy players, controlled strokes, and the non-dominant side. And that's a bit of an odd bird we can't really explain at this point. And the best univariate model for the Crest factor in the early decay phase, then in turn was got a mu estimated with a clearly different group interaction with condition and arm. So 3-way interaction where patients in general had low mu on the dominant side and higher on the non-dominant side, and the opposite for the healthy players. Here again, we can see that the variability in data is larger for the control strokes overall than for the normal. So the takeaway of this rapid go through of the models that we hope to be using in the listening test later on is that early decay spectral centroid seems to be on average lower in normal strokes while approximately normally distributed. So this could be a good one to use to distinguish between the 2 playing conditions. On the other hand, early decay phase of the Crest factor could be a promising candidate to distinguish between all the things that we included. So the 3-way interaction, the group, condition, and the arm, the dominant and non-dominant arm. Whereas the temporal flatness in the early decay phase was less suitable, at least to distinguish between the 2 conditions. But we have to acknowledge this is a very limited sample, like 8 players and with large individual differences. I would be happy to have more, but that was just the data we have. And since we are interested in a way to sort of find out what it is, whether we can hear in terms of these differences, we would like to bring this to the listening test. And in point of that, I would like to bring up some discussion points that I would like to discuss more and have feedback on after this presentation. So given that timbre is a multidimensional, we have not talked here about the loudness part of it, but it's not unlikely that we integrate that also with the spectral information in this very short time window. The question is, what time window is that? So now we chose something that is dependent on the temporal centroid, and that could be seen as a little bit arbitrary. What would be a reasonable time window, considering that these are so short and you don't have too many sample points actually. For the attack, we didn't even bother to include that in the model. So I would welcome information about that and suggestions, and start by saying some acknowledgement. In particular, we would like to thank the participants, but also Olivier, who shared the updated version of Mir events before his actual release of the toolbox. And I should also acknowledge the sponsors, both of the original data collection during my Marie Curie stay in Hanover, and Nordforsk sponsoring the current work. Thank you very much, and here are some references to keep you enjoyed.
Thank you very much, Professor Dahl. We do have time now for questions. Again, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom, or put your question into the Zoom group chat. Professor Dahl, I have a couple of questions for you about this work. Could you speak a bit to the sorts of perceptual correlates you might hypothesize to accompany these differences in technique?
Well, yeah, the perceptual correlates, you mean from the descriptors that we have
yes.
with respect to? Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Like we went with these three ones because well, Spectral Centroid seems to be an important one in general from earlier work, and we thought that from the listening and inspection of the waveforms, we figured that if there was a difference, it seems to be in this early part, and somehow the shape of this early part could be an indicative of what you hear. But since these are short sounds, and the later part is actually a lot of the room and the drum or the membrane vibrating and such, the differences in this early part, they're hard to distinguish or like put a term on. And this is what I found so intriguing and difficult. So I would really welcome more input here. Because I think a lot of the literature is more about distinguishing between instrument categories or different versions, and that makes it difficult. That
Any
wasn't much of an answer.
Or comments? I'm intrigued by your earlier work on this, and this idea of flatness, perception of flatness or dullness to the sound of these drum strokes. And I'm curious if you think this would be influenced by actually seeing the drummer play as well. You know, if the perception of flatness or dullness or length of decay might be influenced in some way by actually watching a player. I'm thinking, of course, specifically about Michael Schutz and Scott Lipscomb's work about 10 years ago with kind of reporting a McGurk style, McGurk type effects in marimba playing. So if a player is doing this sort of thing, it sounds longer than if they're just doing it quickly. Has this been something your group has considered, kind of looking at audio-visual correspondences or
I wouldn't buy it.
Sort of
So at the end of this, I think we would have to go back a little bit to the motion data and actually look at the extent to the variability in how much the stick was controlled after the stroke. That could be one way. But yes, I do think it matters. And I went back to quickly look at some of the videos just to check that they were indeed to following instructions, because it's been a while. And you can see there are like different ways of striking sort of like through the drum and following through with the whole arm, and the more like subtle and relaxed version of doing it. So you can clearly see different ways of doing it. And I do think it has an influence of how we perceive strokes and music in general. Yes, definitely the visual aspect has an influence, yes.
Very interesting. We have a question from Rohit. Could an abrupt change in the rate of decay help mark the boundary between the early and late decay portions?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of that question?
Yes. Could an abrupt change in the rate of decay help mark the boundary between the early and the late decay portions?
Yes, but there doesn't seem to be a consistent one.
Mm.
Maybe Francesco would like to comment more on that. He's been the last one looking deeply at the strokes here, but it's not an abrupt one. We do have, however, we could maybe just take it from the contact time. Maybe that could be one version, but it wouldn't make like more perceptual sense either. But I've been thinking about that, maybe just departing from the contact time with the drumstick and saying that this is the portion we look at.
Excellent.
Yeah.
A question from Claudia Fritz.
Yes, I'm happy to see somebody else struggling when you're actually dealing with real instruments and because I have problems as well. I was wondering, did you ask players to describe the difference? Did you do some linguistic analysis of their answers about the description of the differences they could hear?
Yeah, actually at the time, the idea was to let the players rate the strokes. And in effect, when we collected the data, only 2 of them actually did that. So in the earlier, very short paper that we published in 2008, the drummer had been rating his own strokes. But that was not linguistically. It was more like to the extent that he was pleased with them or not. On a simple scale from 1 to 5. And then we selected the best and the worst stroke for that initial listening tests.
Okay, it was good. My question was more like, you are trying to look for acoustical correlates for these differences between the strokes, and it would be interesting, at least for me, if you could find perceptual correlates to these acoustical correlates. And so I was wondering how they describe the differences.
Yes. So I think the next step would be to first now we have something that we probably will put to a listening test, and then ask people to identify whether they can hear the difference between the instructions. But in the end, we would like to do more of a different scaling. So pairwise comparing two strokes and end up with a multidimensional one. But it could also be interesting to maybe collect descriptors of how you perceive these to differ. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Dahl, and for these questions. There's one additional question in the chat, which unfortunately, in the interest of time, perhaps if Professor Dahl and Francesco, if you could respond to John Vendevert's question in the chat so we can move on to Claudia Fritz, our next speaker today.